previous video, we saw Campbell's argument for why singular terms have a sense that outstrips their referent. Why the meaning of a singular term, in this case a demonstrative, has to be more than simply its referent. Now, just as Frege's puzzle, in combination with the ideas that sense determines reference and plays a cognitive role, can be understood as an argument against direct reference theory. Similarly, Campbell's argument as a kind of Frege's puzzle, the difference being that he has a more refined notion of cognitive value. Campbell's Frege's puzzle, which we saw in the last video, can also be seen as an argument against direct reference theory, that there is no more to meaning than reference. Now, on the other extreme from direct reference theory, there might be one who accepts what Campbell calls a kind of Cartesianism. So what does that mean? Well, to return to the argument from the previous video, one might say perhaps the inference alpha is not actually valid in case 1. So to review, one might wonder whether this inference from thinking that fly is black and that fly is large to inferring that one and the same thing is both black and large, i.e. that it's the same thing that you're thinking about in the first case and the second, that inference is not valid when Elijah is perceptually tracking this object in front of them. Okay? So even though intuitively it seems obvious that one can make this inference when one is paying attention to something as it moves around, one might have a kind of Cartesian view, which says that actually that inference in the case of perceptual tracking is not valid. Someone holding this view would say, following Russell, that all we are directly aware of is our sense data and not external objects. And so we have to constantly determine from one moment to the next whether the sense data that we're receiving is of the same external object. So putting aside the case of Elijah, here's a simpler case. Imagine you are looking at a plant on the table in front of you, and you are attending to it over a period of time of, let's say, 10 seconds. So you're simply just looking at this plant. Now, from one moment to the next, this Cartesian possibility goes. Each moment, you're simply receiving a different piece of sense data. And in order to understand that it's one and the same plant you're looking at as you're simply looking at this thing, you have to reflect on whether, in fact, these momentary sense data are of the same external plant. So on this Cartesian view, no two singular terms, in this case demonstratives, ever share a sense. It's never obvious or manifest to us that we can infer from one moment to the next that it's the same thing we're looking at, even if we're staring straight at it and attending to it. Okay? So this Cartesian possibility is a response to Campbell's Frege's puzzle, which relies on the claim that this kind of inference alpha without the identity premise, okay, so the inference here, which does not rely on this identity premise, that is valid. And the Cartesian says that, in fact, that those kind of premises are never valid. You never have this kind of immediate basis for taking two different thoughts to be about the same external object. Now, in response to that Cartesian possibility, which you can think of as kind of on the opposite extreme as the direct reference theorist. In response to the Cartesian possibility, Campbell argues that there has to be singular terms that share senses, that there must be cases in which inferences like alpha are valid. And this is a kind of transcendental argument, because the argument shows that in order for us to ever be justified in taking two things or two thoughts to be with the same object, in order for us to ever be justified in doing that, inferences like alpha are valid. And since we are sometimes justified in taking two thoughts to be about the same object, there are, therefore, cases in which inferences like alpha are valid. So what is the argument? So the first part of the argument is that we should suppose that no two singular terms ever share a sense. Okay? So what we're doing here is that we're going to actually suppose that the Cartesian possibility is true. And then on the basis of this assumption, we're going to show that we can never be justified in taking two beliefs to be about the same object. But that then means that there must be something wrong with this supposition. Okay? So first, let's make that supposition that no two singular terms ever share a sense. Now, if that were true, in order for any inference like the one below to be valid, we must add an additional identity premise, okay? So if no two singular terms ever share a sense, no arguments like this are ever valid. So this is an argument like of the form of alpha, okay? And so if no two singular terms share a sense, no arguments like this are valid. Rather, we always have to add an additional identity premise, which says that this name here picks up the same referent as the name in the second premise. Okay, so again, this is just elaborating the Cartesian possibility that in order to package together two beliefs that are ostensibly about the same object, we have to reflect and realize that those two beliefs are in fact of the same object. But now in 3, we cannot assume that the occurrences of A between the first premise and the additional premise, the additional identity premise, share a sense. Similarly, we can't assume that A prime in the second premise shares a sense with A prime in the new premise. Okay, so to summarize, the reason why we had to add this identity premise here to this argument was because we couldn't assume that A and A prime are co-referential. So we added this new identity premise saying that they are. But then, notice that we can't assume then that A, as it occurs in the first premise, is co-referential with A as it occurs in this new premise. And we also can't assume that A prime as it occurs in the second premise is the same as A prime that occurs in the new premise, because we're assuming that no two singular terms ever share a sense. So, 4, we must add, so there's a typo here, so let me read this again to be clear. In 4, we must add two identity premises linking the terms in the two initial premises with the terms in the additional identity premise. And we'll have to do this forever, ad infinitum. So I've added here subscripts to indicate what the new identity premises are doing. So here are the three premises of the expanded argument. But now, since we can't assume that any two singular terms share a sense, we actually have to add two more identity premises. So this one here says that A as it occurs in the first premise is the same as it occurs in the new one that was added up here. And this final identity premise says that A prime as it occurs here is the same as A prime as it occurs in the original identity premise. Okay. But now, note that there's a further question of whether these two singular terms, which we've added, are the same as here. Because again, we can't assume that it's ever obvious that two singular terms share a sense. So we'll have to keep on adding more and more identity premises forever. So we're launched on an infinite regress. Any argument like this will have to have infinite premises. But now Campbell says there's no justification that rests on an infinite regress. So an argument with infinite premises cannot provide justification for the conclusion. Okay, however, and this is the transcendental assumption, we are sometimes justified in taking two beliefs to be about the same object. That is, we are sometimes justified in thinking on the basis of two beliefs about something, one to the effect that that thing has a property F, and the other to the effect that that thing has a property G. We are sometimes justified in inferring that those two beliefs are about the same thing, i.e., there is one thing that's both F and G. But 5 represents to us that this Cartesian possibility entails that there is never such justification, that we're never justified in taking two beliefs to be about the same object. Therefore, and this is the conclusion, we should assume that the supposition in 1 is false, i.e., we should assume that it's false, not assume, we should conclude that it's false, that no two singular terms ever share sense. That is, we should conclude that there must be singular terms that sometimes do share a sense. So therefore, this Cartesian possibility is incorrect.